They were told they lacked the intelligence, the courage, the coordination to fly a complex warplane in combat. They were a social experiment set up in a segregated corner of Alabama, expected to fail. But in the skies over Nazi Germany, another story was being written. A story not of failure, but of unmatched discipline. A story where bomber crews facing certain death began to ask for one specific group by name, not for their race, but for the color of their tails. The bright red symbol of survival. This revolution in aerial warfare wasn't born from a grand strategic plan conceived in Washington or London. It was forged in the desperate calculus of survival, 5 miles above a hostile continent. By 1943, the American strategic bombing campaign against Germany was on the verge of collapse. The doctrine was simple, bold, and brutal. Fleets of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators would fly deep into the Reich in broad daylight using their legendary Norden bomb sites to surgically remove Germany's industrial capacity. It was a war of attrition, fought not in muddy trenches, but in the thin, frozen air of the stratosphere. But the theory was bleeding out in practice. For the young men flying these missions, the odds were becoming impossibly long. The 8th Air Force, based in England, and the 15th Air Force, flying out of Italy, were paying a staggering price in blood and treasure. On raids to heavily defended targets like the ball-bearing factories of Schweinfurt or the oil refineries at Ploesti, loss rates could spike to 20%. That meant for every 5 bombers that took off, 1 would not return. The air crews did the grim math. A tour of duty was 25 missions. With these odds, completing a tour was a statistical impossibility. Every mission briefing felt like a eulogy read in advance. The core of this crisis was a simple problem of physics and fuel: range. The primary American escort fighter of the day, the rugged Republic, P-47 Thunderbolt, was a magnificent warplane. It was heavily armed, could absorb astonishing punishment, and was a terror to the Luftwaffe in a dogfight. But it had a fatal flaw. It was thirsty. Its engines consumed fuel at a prodigious rate, meaning it could only escort the big friends, the heavy bombers, part of the way to their distant targets. Bomber crews came to dread the moment their little friends would waggle their wings and peel away, back toward home. From that point on, they were alone, sailing through hundreds of miles of hostile airspace, defended only by their own machine guns against the wolves of the Luftwaffe. The German pilots were not fools. They learned to wait. They knew the operational radius of the American fighters to the mile. They would mass their forces, biding their time just outside the Thunderbolt's reach. The moment the American escorts turned for home, the German fighters would pounce. They swarmed the bomber boxes in coordinated waves, their cannons tearing through the thin aluminum skin of the fortresses and Liberators. This tactical crisis was compounded by a cultural one within the American fighter command. The path to glory for a fighter pilot was to become an ace. Fame was measured in victory markings stenciled below the cockpit. This created a powerful incentive for pilots to be aggressive, to break formation and chase after German fighters, seeking that one-on-one duel that could add to their score. While this produced heroes, it often undermined the primary mission, protecting the bombers. An escort pilot chasing a lone Messerschmitt 50 miles away was one less gun protecting the formation from the main German assault. The system rewarded individual achievement over collective defense, and the bomber crews were paying the price. Into this maelstrom of failing strategy and tactical desperation, a new unit was arriving. The pilots of the 99th Fighter Squadron, the first aviators trained at Tuskegee, had already been fighting in the Mediterranean. Now they were being consolidated with other Tuskegee-trained squadrons to form the 332nd Fighter Group. They were stepping onto a stage where the stakes couldn't be higher and where the prevailing wisdom was failing spectacularly. They carried not only the hopes of their communities back home, but also the heavy burden of prejudice that assumed they were destined for mediocrity. They were about to be handed a new aircraft, the P-51 Mustang, and a new, impossible assignment: protect the bombers at all costs. The man tasked with leading the 332nd Fighter Group into this crucible was Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. He was not just a military officer. He was the living embodiment of the struggle his men represented. The son of the first African-American general in the United States Army, Davis had endured 4 years of suffocating silence at West Point, where no fellow cadet would speak to him outside the line of duty. He understood better than anyone that his men were fighting 2 wars simultaneously, one against the Luftwaffe in the air, and another against prejudice on the ground. He knew that every action, every success, and especially every failure would be scrutinized under a microscope. Mediocrity was not an option. For Davis, the mission was clear, and it went far beyond shooting down German planes. It was about proving, once and for all, the fallacy of racial inferiority. He saw the bomber crisis not just as a tactical problem, but as an opportunity. While other fighter group commanders encouraged a culture of aggressive individualism, celebrating the high-scoring aces, Davis looked at the staggering bomber losses and drew a radically different conclusion. He recognized that the unwritten rules of fighter combat were serving the egos of pilots, not the strategic objectives of the air war. The true measure of an escort's success, he reasoned, was not a tally of enemy aircraft destroyed. The true measure was the number of bombers that made it home. From this simple, powerful insight, he forged a new doctrine, a set of commandments that would come to define his unit. The core tenet was absolute: stay with the bombers. At every briefing, Davis and his squadron leaders hammered this point home with relentless consistency. They were forbidden from breaking formation to chase a distant German fighter. They were not to be lured into individual dogfights far from the bomber stream. Their job was to form a protective shield, a close, unwavering cordon of steel around their vulnerable charges. They were to engage only when the bombers were directly threatened. Their primary objective was to drive the attackers off, to break up their assault waves, and to force them to disengage. A kill was a secondary bonus, not the main goal. This was heresy in the world of 1944 fighter aviation. It demanded a level of restraint and discipline that ran counter to the very nature of a fighter pilot, young, aggressive, and trained to hunt. It meant watching a German plane flee and letting it go, knowing that pursuing it would create a gap in the defensive screen. It meant sacrificing personal glory for the collective good. To his pilots, Davis's message was unambiguous. Our job is to protect the bombers. If we do that, we are succeeding. If we lose them, we have failed, no matter how many enemy planes we shoot down. This philosophy was put into practice as the group transitioned to the perfect tool for the job, the North American P-51 Mustang. The Mustang was a technological miracle. Powered by the legendary British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it was fast, agile, and most importantly, it had legs. Equipped with external drop tanks, the P-51 could fly farther than any single-engine fighter of its day. It could accompany the B-17s and B-24s all the way to Berlin, to Ploesti, to any target in the Third Reich, and all the way back. The range problem that had created the Luftwaffe's killing grounds was finally solved. Now the 332nd had both the machine and the mindset to change the war in the air. They would not be the distant guardians who departed halfway through the fight. They would be the constant, menacing presence from the moment they rendezvoused with the bombers until the fields of England or Italy were once again in sight. Davis had given them their mission. The Mustang had given them the reach. All that was left was to prove the doctrine worked. In early 1944, from their base at Ramitelli Airfield in Italy, the 332nd Fighter Group prepared to put their new doctrine to the ultimate test. But Colonel Davis understood something profound about warfare. Battles are won not just with tactics and technology, but with psychology. He needed a way to communicate his unit's unique commitment, not just to his own pilots, but to the anxious bomber crews they were tasked to protect, and, just as importantly, to the enemy. He needed a brand. The solution was as simple as it was brilliant. He ordered the entire tail section of his group's P-51 Mustangs, vertical stabilizer, rudder, and horizontal stabilizers, to be painted a deep, vibrant red. It was a bold, almost audacious choice. At a time when camouflage was the prevailing wisdom, designed to help aircraft blend in with the sky or the ground, the red tails were designed to do the exact opposite. They were designed to be seen. This was a deliberate act of psychological warfare. For the bomber crews, often flying for 10 hours, in a state of constant, gut-wrenching tension, the sight of that flash of red on the horizon was an instant signal. It was a visual promise. It meant their guardians were on station. It wasn't just any escort group. It was the one group that had made an ironclad vow to stay with them, no matter what. The nickname Red Tail Angels began to circulate through the mess halls and briefing rooms of the 15th Air Force. It was a name born of relief and gratitude, a testament to the morale boost that distinctive paint scheme provided. For the pilots of the Luftwaffe, the red tails became an ominous symbol. It was a warning sign. Attacking a bomber formation protected by these brightly marked fighters meant stepping into a hornet's nest. German pilots knew that these escorts would not be easily lured away. An attack on a bomber would be met with a furious, disciplined, and immediate response from a swarm of Mustangs that refused to be distracted. The red tails signaled that this would be no easy hunt for stragglers. It would be a head-on clash with a dedicated, immovable shield. The paint was more than just decoration. It was a declaration of intent. It told friend and foe alike that the 332nd Fighter Group played by a different set of rules. Their identity was inextricably linked to the bombers. Their arena was not the free-for-all of the lone wolf, but the deadly space immediately surrounding the heavy bomber formations. They were not just escorts. They were shepherds, and they had marked their flock for all the world to see. As the missions grew longer and more dangerous, the effectiveness of this twin strategy, unwavering discipline and high-visibility branding, began to show in the cold, hard numbers. Bomber groups escorted by the Red Tails started reporting something remarkable: fewer losses. While other groups returned to base, telling tales of aerial victories, the 332nd returned with a different and far more vital accomplishment. They brought the bombers home. Word began to spread, not through official channels or press releases, but through the most reliable information network in the military: the informal grapevine of combat crews. Bomber pilots and gunners, after a harrowing mission, would talk. They compared notes. Who was with you when you got hit over Munich? Which escort group scattered when the Me-262 jets showed up? And increasingly, who was with you on the mission where everyone came back? Over and over, the answer came back the same: It was the Red Tails. This wasn't a myth or a legend in the making. It was a battlefield reality being forged in fire, mission by mission. The trust they built was not given. It was earned in the skies over Austria, Romania, and southern Germany, paid for with vigilance, discipline, and the lives of their own pilots who fell defending the big friends. By the summer of 1944, the reputation of the 332nd Fighter Group had solidified from battlefield rumor into established fact. The name Red Tails was no longer just a nickname, it was a guarantee. The informal chatter among bomber crews had reached the ears of their commanders, the men who planned the missions and had to account for every lost aircraft and crew. These commanders were pragmatists, tasked with achieving strategic objectives while minimizing the horrific cost. They began to notice a clear statistical pattern. Missions escorted by the Red Tails consistently showed lower, often dramatically lower, bomber loss rates than missions escorted by other fighter groups. This data was undeniable. It wasn't about politics or social experiments anymore. It was about combat effectiveness. What had started as a preference whispered among air crews escalated into formal requests. Bomber group commanders, responsible for the lives of thousands of men, began specifically asking for the 332nd to be their escort, especially on the tough runs. When the mission planners pointed to a target deep in enemy territory, bristling with flak batteries and known to be a favorite haunt of the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter wings, the request would come down the line, "Get us the Red Tails." This was an unprecedented development. In the vast, impersonal machinery of the air war, units were typically assigned based on availability, operational readiness, and rotation. For one specific fighter group to be requested by name was a testament to the supreme confidence they inspired. They had become the most in-demand escort unit in the entire 15th Air Force. Colonel Davis's contrarian doctrine had been vindicated in the most powerful way imaginable, not by commendations from generals, but by the desperate pleas of the men whose lives depended on it. The pilots of the 332nd flew with a unique and immense pressure. They knew they were being watched, judged not only by their own high command, but by the hundreds of bomber crews who were, quite literally, putting their lives in their hands based on reputation alone. This created a powerful feedback loop of excellence. The group's reputation demanded discipline, and their discipline enhanced their reputation. They were no longer just another fighter group in the rotation. They were a special asset, the elite guard called upon when the stakes were highest. Their arena was the most dangerous airspace in the world. They escorted bombers to the heavily defended oil fields of Ploesti in Romania, a target so brutal it was known to air crews as the graveyard of the 15th Air Force. They flew cover for raids on industrial complexes in southern Germany and Austria, navigating treacherous mountain weather and relentless fighter attacks. On every mission, the calculus remained the same. While other escort pilots might see a bomber formation as a starting point for a hunt, the Red Tails saw it as the territory they had to defend. They flew a tighter formation, their eyes constantly scanning not just for distant enemy fighters, but for the telltale signs of a bomber in distress, a smoking engine, a feathered propeller. They were aerial bodyguards, and their client was the entire bomber stream. This intense focus did not mean they avoided combat. On the contrary, they fought, and fought viciously. But their fighting was always defensive in nature. Luftwaffe ace Günter Rahl would later recall encountering the Red Tails, noting their distinct tactics. He observed that they stuck to the bombers like glue, and that they never chased. An attack on one of their charges was met with a swift and overwhelming counterattack, but the moment the threat was neutralized, the red tails would return to their protective positions. They refused to be drawn into a sprawling, chaotic dogfight miles away from the bombers. Their discipline was their deadliest weapon, and it was saving American lives on an industrial scale. The ultimate validation of the red tail doctrine came on March 24, 1945. By this point in the war, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, battered and broken by years of relentless combat. However, a new and terrifying threat had emerged in the skies over Germany: the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It was a quantum leap in aviation technology, capable of speeds over 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51 Mustang. For conventional propeller-driven fighters, engaging in Me-262 was like trying to fight a ghost. It could appear, strike with its devastating 30-millimeter cannons, and vanish before the Allied pilots could even react. The jet's primary targets were the slow, lumbering heavy bombers. A single pass from an Me-262 could be enough to dismember a B-17. On this day, the target was the Daimler-Benz tank factory in Berlin, the very heart of the Third Reich. For the 15th Air Force flying from Italy, this was an epic undertaking, a 1,600-mile round trip that would push crews and aircraft to the absolute limits of their endurance. It was the longest escort mission ever flown by the unit. The bomber crews knew the danger. Berlin was defended by a massive concentration of anti-aircraft guns and was the primary operational area for the Luftwaffe's new jet fighter wings. The mission was a direct challenge, a dagger aimed at the capital of a dying but still dangerous empire. The 332nd Fighter Group was assigned to provide target support, the most critical phase of the mission, protecting the bombers as they made their final run over the city. As the vast formation of American bombers approached Berlin, the jets appeared. They came in high and fast, their shark-like silhouettes a terrifying sight against the cold March sky. They sliced through the air with a speed that seemed to defy physics, ignoring the conventional escorts to line up their attacks on the bombers. This was the moment of truth for Colonel Davis's doctrine. An individualistic pilot, seeing a jet, might be tempted to give chase, to engage in a history-making dogfight against this new superweapon. But the red tails held their ground. Adhering to their ironclad discipline, they stayed with the bombers, weaving a tight, protective screen around the formation. They couldn't outrun the jets, but they could outthink them. They positioned themselves between the attackers and their prey. When the Me-262s swooped in for their firing passes, they found their paths blocked by a wall of red-tailed Mustangs. The red-tail pilots used their superior maneuverability at lower speeds, forcing the jet pilots to either break off their attacks or risk overshooting into the gun sights of a P-51. It was a masterful display of defensive flying. They did not chase, they did not scatter. They held the line. In the ferocious air battle that raged in the skies over Berlin, the 332nd engaged both the new jets and the remaining conventional German fighters. They flew through a storm of flak and cannon fire. They fought with a calculated fury, their sole focus being the survival of the bombers entrusted to their care. The result of that day's combat would enter the annals of military history. The red tails shot down 3 Me-262 jets for the loss of one of their own pilots, a remarkable feat against a technologically superior foe. But that was not the most important statistic of the day. The truly stunning achievement was this. Of the dozens of bombers the 332nd was directly assigned to protect during that critical phase over Berlin, not a single one was lost to enemy fighters. They had taken their flock into the lion's den and brought every single one of them home. It was the perfect, undeniable exclamation point on their entire combat career. The Berlin mission was a spectacular climax, but it was just one day in a long campaign of quiet, disciplined excellence. The legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen, however, extends far beyond their impressive combat record. Their performance in the skies over Europe became a powerful, irrefutable argument in a battle being fought back home, the battle for civil rights and the desegregation of the American military. To understand their impact, one must remember the context from which they emerged. The Tuskegee experiment was born from a deeply racist ideology, codified in a 1925 Army War College study, which concluded that African Americans were inherently subservient, lacked initiative, and were mentally inferior, making them unfit for complex combat roles, especially aviation. The prevailing belief in much of the military and political establishment was that black soldiers were, at best, suited for labor battalions and service roles, safely behind the lines. The Tuskegee program was, in the eyes of many of its proponents, designed to fail, thereby providing proof of these racist assumptions. Every pilot who earned his wings at Tuskegee knew this. They flew under a weight that other aviators did not carry. They knew that a single mistake, a moment of cowardice, or a display of incompetence, would be used not just to judge them as individuals, but to condemn their entire race in the eyes of the nation. This immense pressure could have broken them. Instead, it forged a unique culture of professionalism and an unyielding commitment to perfection. They could not afford to be merely good. They had to be demonstrably better. Colonel Davis's bomber escort doctrine was, in many ways, the perfect strategic response to this social pressure. By prioritizing the protection of bombers over the pursuit of individual glory, the Red Tails created a metric of success that was objective, quantifiable, and undeniable: the number of bombers saved. An ace with 20 kills could be dismissed as a gifted individual, an exception to the rule. But a group that consistently brought home more bombers than anyone else, that was evidence of systemic superiority, superior discipline, superior training, and superior leadership. It was a fact that could not be explained away by prejudice. Throughout the war, their performance data was being collected, analyzed, and circulated within the highest levels of the Army Air Forces. The numbers told a story that defied every stereotype. Here was a group of men, deemed inferior by official doctrine, who were outperforming their white counterparts in one of the most demanding and critical missions of the air war. They were not just meeting the standard. They were setting a new one. When the war ended, the soldiers returned home. The Tuskegee Airmen returned as heroes, yet they came back to a nation that still treated them as second-class citizens. The same men who had been trusted to protect the lives of bomber crews over Germany were denied basic rights in their own country. But they had brought back something more valuable than medals. They had brought back proof. In the post-war debate over the future of the American Armed Forces, the story of the Tuskegee Airmen became a central piece of evidence for advocates of desegregation. Proponents of the old, segregated military could no longer credibly argue that integration would weaken combat effectiveness. The Red Tails had proven the opposite. Their success demonstrated that talent and courage were not determined by the color of a man's skin. They had shown that when given equal training and opportunity, African American soldiers could perform at the highest possible level. Their record became a weapon in the hands of civil rights leaders and progressive military officials. The inarguable success of the Tuskegee Airmen created a political and moral imperative that the White House could no longer ignore. President Harry Truman, himself a World War I veteran, was faced with the hypocrisy of a nation that had fought a war against a racist tyranny abroad while enforcing racial segregation at home. The performance of units like the 332nd provided him with the ammunition he needed to confront the deeply entrenched traditionalists in the military establishment. On July 26, 1948, President Truman signed Executive Order 9981. The order's language was simple but revolutionary. It stated, "It is hereby declared to be the policy of the President that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin." This was the death knell for segregation in the United States military. It was a pivotal moment in the American Civil Rights Movement, and the ink on that order was written with the legacy of the Red Tails. Their story is not just one of aerial combat. It is a profound lesson in how battlefield performance can drive social change. They fought and won their 2 wars. In the first, against the Luftwaffe, they earned the respect and gratitude of the men they protected. In the second, against prejudice, they dismantled a century of racist doctrine with undeniable proof of their skill and patriotism. The bright red tails of their Mustangs began as a tactical choice, a way to be seen by friend and foe. But they evolved into something far greater. They became a symbol of a radical idea, that true strength is found not in division and exclusion, but in discipline, unity, and a shared commitment to a common mission. The young men who flew those fighters were asked to be more than just pilots. They were asked to be pioneers, to carry the hopes of millions on their wings, and to prove their worth in the deadliest arena on Earth. They answered that call by refusing to chase personal glory, choosing instead the quiet, profound heroism of the Guardian. They measured their success not in planes shot down, but in lives brought home. And in doing so, the Tuskegee Airmen, the Red Tail Angels, not only helped win a world war, but they also pointed their nation toward a more just and equal future.